Yeah.
So he'll have fresh copies.
Wow.
Oh, I'm sure all the staff has it and everything.
It's just going to be the way it is.
And I think he's prepared for that.
It's a big.
Good afternoon. This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to today's legislative hearing on H.R. 3497, H.R. 4245, a draft bill entitled the Veterans Affairs Purchase Card Misuse Mitigation Act, and a draft bill requiring the Secretary to carry out the Medical Surgical Prime Vendor Program using multiple prime vendors. Before we begin, I would like to ask unanimous consent for our colleague, Conference Chair Kathy McMorris-Rogers, to sit on the dais and participate in these proceedings when she arrives. Also, the Veterans of Foreign Wars has informed us that they will provide a statement regarding the hearing, so I ask unanimous consent that it be entered into the record. Without objection, so ordered. I'm also happy to welcome Ranking Member Walsh as an ex officio member of the subcommittee. Glad you're with us. Our first two pieces of legislation this afternoon relate to VA's Electronic Health Records Modernization Program. Ms. McMorris-Rogers will present her legislation, H.R. 3497, upon her arrival. First, I would like to briefly discuss a bill that I am proud to sponsor with Chairman Rowe as well as Ranking Members Walsh and Custer, H.R. 4245, the Veterans Electronic Health Record Modernization Oversight Act of 2017. The EHRM program is a potential game changer for VA. If carried out successfully, VA and DoD can finally achieve a seamless lifetime medical record, eliminate the need to fax records back and forth with community providers, and break the ruinous cycle where legacy systems cost of maintenance consumes nearly the entire IT budget. EHRM is as transformational as it is big and expensive, and Congress needs to keep a watchful eye on it. H.R. 4245 requires VA to provide us with key contracting documents and those that indicate the program's health. It also requires VA to notify Congress of any significant schedule slip, cost increase, loss of data, privacy breach, or other adverse contractual event. Finally, it ensures my colleagues and me that my colleagues and I get the information we actually need in a timely fashion, while not directing the VA to spend time and money producing unnecessary reports or duplicative documentation. Next, I intend to sponsor the Veterans Affairs Purchase Card Misuse Mitigation Act, which is currently in draft form with Ms. Rice, Mr. Bost, and Dr. Dunn. This bill would require the Secretary to revoke the purchase card or purchase card approval authority for any employee who is found to have knowingly misused the purchase card. Huge sums of money flow through purchase cards in the VA, about $4 billion a year as of 2015, the last time GAO did a review. And the volume of spending is poised to grow much larger given that the most recent NDAA increased the micro purchase transaction limit from $3,500 to $10,000. This committee heard a great deal about purchase card misuse in 2015. Huge amounts of unauthorized commitments were alleged. The Inspector General recently completed his definitive report on the matter and found that the real amounts to be much higher than originally thought. Unauthorized commitments estimated at roughly $520.7 million for prosthetics, including purchases worth $256.7 million for which VA may have paid unnecessarily high prices. While most of the purchases were necessary supplies that were delivered, we will never know how much money was wasted because a lack of documentation makes drawing firm conclusions frustratingly difficult. VA tightened its internal controls in response, but we still hear of troubling incidents. The Inspector General recently found widespread split purchasing in the New Jersey healthcare system, more concentrated splitting in Vision 15, and unauthorized commitments and subterfuge about the destruction of records at the VA contracting office in the Bronx. A few weeks ago, the Office of Special Counsel revealed an apparent scheme by 2 employees at the Bedford, Massachusetts Medical Center to enrich a family member through purchase card orders. And this very morning, the IG released his final report on the Washington, D.C. Medical Center, finding purchase card misuse among many other distressing incidents of mismanagement. In D.C., 151 people held 283 purchase cards. Most of the purchase card holders are outside the typical chain of command, and their usage cannot be properly tracked. The IG highlighted many examples of gratuitous waste and one example of outright graft, which I would like to point out that the VISN did discover and address. This bill attempts to head off purchase card misuse as the micro-purchase threshold increases. As soon as a bona fide investigation determines someone has knowingly misused a purchase card, the card is taken away. The department can pursue the appropriate disciplinary penalty according to existing policies, but in the meantime, the potential for future misuse is eliminated. It's as simple as that. Finally, I intend to sponsor legislation with Mr. Peters, Mr. Banks, and Dr. Dunn to direct the Secretary to continue carrying out the medical surgical prime vendor program using the existing system of regional prime vendors. At our hearing in December, committee members overwhelmingly expressed the view that it would be a mistake for VA to move to a model with one national prime vendor that not only distributes the medical and surgical supplies, but also creates the formulary on behalf of VA's behalf and selects the suppliers. I understand VA heard the same message from industry and now does not intend to pursue that model. So I hope to get additional clarity in today's questioning on how the VA still opposes this bill. However, I will defer to my colleagues to elaborate on the draft legislation. I now yield to Ranking Member Custer for any opening statement and remarks on today's legislation she may have.
Thank you, Chairman Bergman, for holding this hearing, and I'd like to welcome Ranking Member Walz, and when she arrives, our esteemed colleague, Congresswoman McMorris Rogers, here to advocate on behalf of the bipartisan legislation that we have before us. I also want to welcome our witnesses who are here to provide thoughtful testimony on how we might improve the legislation to ensure that it has the intended effect, which is helping to improve the Veterans Administration and the lives of veterans. I'm proud of the bipartisan oversight and legislative work that we do on this committee. This subcommittee serves as a model for how Congress should work, and I should say our full committee serves as a model. Before I turn to my remarks on the 4 bills we have on the agenda today, I do want to take a moment to address the IG report that was released just this morning on the D.C. VAMC, Washington, D.C., and Secretary Shulkin's announcement this morning that VISN's 1, which is New England, 5, which is D.C., and 22, the Desert Pacific Health Care Network, will be placed into receivership, and Brigadier General Gamble will oversee their restructuring. This is a critical moment. For those of us in VISN 1 in New England, we've spent the last year plus working with Secretary Shulkin and the leadership at the VA on some very troubling, disturbing allegations of mismanagement and veterans that have been harmed, not just in Manchester, New Hampshire, where I'm the VISN the VA Health Center that I have been working with and vets that I represent, but also Bedford, Massachusetts, and our colleague, Mr. Poliquin, has been involved with Maine. I know that my colleagues from California have had issues in VISN 22, and the whole committee is aware of the issues in VISN 5. The DC IG report found that leadership at the medical center, the VISN, and the VA central office knew about the supply chain and logistics problems at DC VAMC and did not take appropriate steps. The Desert Pacific Network includes the Phoenix VA, where we first learned about the secret waiting lists that ultimately led to the choice program. And in New England, where my constituents receive care, the hospital director at the Manchester VAMC was removed because significant patient care and facility infrastructure concerns were not addressed. So I would request that our Oversight and Investigation Committee or the full committee hold a hearing on leadership failures at the 3 networks at VA Central Office, and that we continue to provide oversight on the plan being developed for restructuring of these organizations, including, as we'll discuss today, the VA procurement investigation. At least 7 members of our committee represent districts within these 3 networks, and I'm sure that many more of our members have constituents who receive their care there. Now, returning to the legislation before us today, we address of-the-moment issues for our subcommittee. Ranking Member Walz's Veterans Electronic Health Record Modernization Oversight Act will ensure that this committee receives the information we need to conduct proper oversight of this 10-year, $16 billion project. I think I speak for all of us when I say we have been advocating for an interoperable electronic health record since we were first elected to Congress. Finally, the solution is in sight. When Secretary Shulkin signs the contract, and we believe that that will happen this month, veterans will finally have the same health care records as the DoD, a modern electronic health record that will meet their health care needs. The next challenge will be to ensure the VA stays on schedule with its installation and implementation, stays within the budget, and causes the least amount of disruption to patient care. And I know Dr. Rowe, our chair, has been admonishing all of us to understand that this will take time and it will be a transition, but it's important that we minimize the disruption. Our job here is to keep the VA on track, and Ranking Member Walz's bill will give us the tools and the information to do just that. Excuse me. Chairman Bergman and Congresswoman Rice's draft legislation to address purchase card abuse is also much needed legislation that I hope this committee will send to the floor without delay. Yesterday, I publicly revealed my request to Secretary Shulkin to remove Dr. Mayo Smith as leader of the VA New England healthcare system, and Secretary Shulkin did announce this morning that Dr. Mayo Smith will retire. The issues our committee has investigated in Bedford and Manchester demonstrate the need for greater accountability and improved leadership. Purchase card abuse continues to be an issue. And just last month, we learned in an Office of Special Counsel report that an employee at the Bedford, Massachusetts VA medical facility abused a purchase card to buy supplies from a family member's business, as my chair has acknowledged. We also learned that this employee was authorized to use a purchase card even after being disciplined for misuse. This is unacceptable, and that employee got what amounted to simply a slap on the wrist. Employees who misuse purchase cards should be held accountable and should be prevented from being a purchase card holder or authorizing official. This legislation will ensure that taxpayer dollars are protected from purchase card misuse. Employees misusing VA purchase cards cannot be trusted as good stewards of taxpayer dollars, and I support the legislation tackling this issue. And finally, Congressman Bergman, our chair of the subcommittee, and Peters have written legislation to ensure VA fixes its medical surgical prime vendor formulary. As we heard from the GAO last November, clinicians who treat veterans should be at the center of the decision-making of which supplies should be included in the formulary. This is not a decision that should be outsourced to vendors who have no experience treating patients. This idea to outsource the formulary development suggested by VA goes against best practices in the private and nonprofit healthcare industry. This legislation should ensure that VA follows best practices and sticks to a timeline so that VA facilities and vendors have a predictable, functional medical surgical supply system. Thank you, Chairman Bergman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Custer. And given the Secretary's announcement today regarding adverse actions against three VISN directors, I would be happy to continue working with the Ranking Member and the rest of the subcommittee to get answers. I sent a letter with Ranking Member Custer last month to the VA, which we have yet to receive a response. So we're going to continue working on that. We will now hear from Ranking Member Walz, speaking in support of H.R. 4245, the Veterans Electronic Health Record Modernization Oversight Act of 2017. Ranking Member Walz, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here, but thank you, Chairman, for the courtesy of speaking on this, and to the Ranking Member. Before we start, I'd like to say I thank you, Chairman, for backing. I fully support the Ranking Member's Custer's call for a hearing or whatever is necessary on the leadership failures in New England, Capital Region, and Desert Pacific regions. I believe Secretary Shulkin's taken the right steps of removal, but we need to exercise our oversight authority, which this subcommittee has proven up to that task. We also need to keep pressure on the VA to improve D.C. VA's supply chain management capabilities. We visited about a year ago following the interim report and pushed for more hiring of logistics and HR staff, cleaning of supply spaces that ensure at least enough supplies to prevent further delays. I want to note and praise the dedicated workers and providers who did ensure that no patients were harmed despite incompetent leadership and supply chain failures at the hospital. Now the VA must work to ensure that every single one of their 40 recommendations of the IG report are followed through and VAs held accountable. With that, I appreciate the opportunity to speak on H.R. 4245, the Veterans Electronic Health Record Modernization Act. I, along with the Chairman, the Ranking Member, and Chairman Rowe of the full committee, introduced this to ensure that we continue to exercise one of our most important functions, oversight. And the Ranking Member was right. I was looking back in March of 2007, sitting right down here, I made the case of an interoperability between records was absolutely critical. I think every one of us who's come here, matriculated in here, has said that. And one of the first things we do of getting there, in June of 2017, and many of us will remember that day, the Secretary answered this call and announced VA's intent to adopt the same Cerner EHR currently utilized by Department of Defense. Now, Congress and veterans are eager to see the implementation of this new system. Frankly, the future successful delivery of VA and community-based health care services to veterans really rests on the successful implementation of this record management system. In order to deliver on promises that we've made to veterans in regard to accessibility and quality of care, we must ensure VA has every resource necessary to the development of this new system. However, Congress must be able to track these resources and the impact of their progress. In order to be good stewards of the taxpayer money, we must be able to carry out those oversight duties. This legislation that we're going to talk about simply requires VA to share documents, plans, reports, and information surrounding the adoption and implementation of the new EHR management system. Additionally, the legislation will require VA to notify Congress quickly if there's any significant adverse events, such as a cost increase, schedule delay, or breach of security. That's why I really appreciate the support of H.R. 4245 and its inclusion in today's discussion. I also appreciate the VA's willingness to continue to work with our office to ensure this legislation is clear, reasonable, effective, and can be implemented the way it needs to be. Our intention is not to micromanage the implementation of this record. Our intent is to make sure on something this big and this costly and this important that there's ownership for everyone, that the VSOs are included, which I'm glad to see Lou's at the table. This is going to be critical, and I think the Chairman's exactly right. He brings a wealth of knowledge. He's implemented these in the private sector. Having watched a large medical institution like the Mayo Clinic Institute, an upgrade to a new electronic medical record, we need to keep expectations high of where we're going to achieve, but realistic in that this is going to take time. And there's going to be things along the way that need to be addressed. I think the biggest thing this legislation is no surprises, Congress being informed, let us know how things are going so that we can inform veterans. So thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Walz. Next, we will hear from Ms. Rice speaking in support of the draft Veterans Affairs Purchase Card Misuse Mitigation Act. Ms. Rice, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman Bergman and Ranking Member Custer for including the draft bill regarding purchase card misuse on today's legislative hearing agenda for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. I'd also like to thank all the witnesses who are here today for your testimony and for sharing your views on the draft legislation. I appreciate the opportunity to join Chairman Bergman in introducing this important piece of legislation as the lead Democratic sponsor. This bill would prohibit employees at the Department of Veterans Affairs who are found to have knowingly misused VA purchase cards from serving as purchase card holders or approving officials. I believe this legislation is necessary to prevent any future misuse of purchase cards and will provide greater accountability within the VA. Now, in May of 2015, this subcommittee held a hearing on waste, fraud, and abuse in the VA's purchase card program, during which alarming testimony was presented about a lack of internal controls at VA that had led to misuse of taxpayer funds through the purchase card program. During the hearing, former subcommittee Chairman Kaufman and I requested that the VA Office of Inspector General review allegations of unauthorized commitments at a VA facility in my home state, New York, in the Bronx. In reviewing these allegations, the VA OIG determined that the purchase card program manager erroneously reported approximately $54.4 million of contract purchases in FY 2011 and 2012 because the contract manager did not provide oversight or ensure proper implementation of the required federal procurement data system reporting. VA OIG also identified 11 unauthorized commitments totaling about $457,000 in improper payments for prosthetic purchases that exceeded the warrants of the purchasers. Purchase card misuse continues to be a problem at VA facilities. In late January of this year, the Office of the Special Counsel released a report finding that a VA employee at a medical center in Massachusetts had misused a purchase card to make nearly $1 million in improper purchases. Recent examples such as this reveal a need for legislation that will support effective oversight of the purchase card program and help to increase accountability at the VA. I thank Chairman Bergman for his leadership on this bill to address such cases of purchase card misuse that harm the public trust that VA is properly executing its duties. As members of the Committee on Veterans Affairs, it is our responsibility to take allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse seriously and ensure that taxpayer funds are not misused to the detriment of our nation's veterans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. Now we will hear from Mr. Peters speaking in support of the draft medical surgical prime vendor legislation. Mr. Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Ranking Member Custer. And thanks also to Mr. Banks in particular for working with me to improve the medical surgical prime vendor program, including the bill we're considering today. Last November, Mr. Banks and I hosted a successful roundtable with the VA and medical device companies to get feedback on the MSVPV program. We kicked off a good discussion, and today we're continuing the conversation to help get this program on track with all stakeholders at the table. This bill will require the VA to award contracts to at least 2 regional prime vendors for medical supplies, a great first step to improve the MSPV program by fostering transparency and creating competition to drive prices down. It's also critical that we have doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals advising us on which supplies and devices are needed to create a formulary so the VA can provide proper care. Ultimately, we want to be able to help the VA to be a better business partner. We know it wants to be a better business partner. And we want to give veterans the best treatment by ensuring we get the right people at the table to make these clinical decisions. I look forward to working on this bill with my colleagues and for further discussions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Do we know how?
We don't really know how far.
Okay, well, Ms. McMorris-Rogers is en route, but since she is not here yet, what we'll do is we're going to start, I'll do the introduction of the panel, and then we'll see if she shows up by that time. But the point is, when she arrives, we will stop what we're doing at that point and hear from her. So, you know, at this point, I'm like, now welcome the members of our panel who are seated at the witness table. With us today from VA, we have Mr. Fred Mingo, Director of Program Control for the Electronic Health Record Modernization Program. He is accompanied by Mr. Ricky Lamone, who the Acting Deputy Chief Procurement Officer for the Veterans Health Administration. He is also accompanied by Ms. Katrina Tusamatatelli. I think I got close. And her role is the Health Portfolio Director for the Office of Information and Technology. Also accompanying Mr. Mingo is Mr. John Adams, Director of Corporate Travel in the Office of Management, seated back there. And also on the panel, we have Mr. Louis Celli, Director of the Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation Division at the American Legion. Finally, we have Mr. Scott Deniston, the Executive Director of the National Veterans Small Business Coalition. Mr. Mingo, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Chairman Bergman, Ranking Member Custer, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to present VA's views on pending bills before the committee. Joining me today are Ms. Katrina Tutamatelli, OIT, Mr. John Adams, OM, Mr. Ricky Lamont, VHA, who can speak more specifically about legislation in their area. The intent of H.R. 3497 is to provide veterans access to their personal medical history, enabling them to share their medical records with VA and community providers. This legislation directs the Secretary to carry out a pilot program establishing a secure, portable medical records storage device. VA does not support this legislation due to a number of challenges. First, doctors have been reluctant to accept plug-in electronic devices from patients because of network security and compatibility issues with electronic health records. Second, even with a portable storage device, veterans may not receive a copy of their most current medical record. Depending upon when files are loaded into the device, it may not represent the complete health record, including important doctor's notes or test results ordered from a previous visit. Lastly, this legislation would take resources away from the VA's current efforts to establish a single electronic health record that is interoperable with DoD and community providers. VA supports providing veterans access to their medical records and data and believes that this legislation would not achieve that outcome. H.R. 4245 requires the VA to submit several project management documents related to the Electronic Health Record Modernization Program. VA supports this legislation and believes transparency is important to the success of the EHRM program. The EHRM Program Executive Office would like to work with the committee to develop a mutually agreeable timeline to brief staff on these project management documents. We are committed to providing quality and accurate project management documents to the committee. The draft purchase card bill directs the Secretary to prohibit employees found to have knowingly misused a VA purchase card from further serving as a purchase card holder or approving authority. VA supports the draft bill as it would enhance the department's efforts to reduce potential fraud, waste, and abuse within the VA charge card program. In addition, it would reduce charge card misuse and minimize costly reconciliation when unauthorized commitments are identified. VA believes this legislation will support sound charge card program oversight and encourage appropriate staff to strictly adhere to purchasing requirements as outlined in VA financial policy. Lastly, the draft medical surgical prime vendor bill would statutorily define the structure of VA's MSPV program and the number of items provided in its formulary. VA opposes this bill for a number of reasons. First, Congress has already provided, and the Federal Acquisition Regulation has already implemented suitable tools for VA to make sound business decisions in developing the MSPV program. Secondly, agencies are required to conduct market research as part of their acquisition planning efforts. VA has a further requirement to conduct additional market research to fulfill our mandate under the Veterans First contracting program. This market research enables VA to structure acquisitions appropriately based on the number and types of vendors available, the geographic areas they serve, and the need to ensure supply chain availability. The current MSPV structure is based on a judgment call to apply the criteria provided by Congress and the FAR consuls. Legislation that stipulates the MSPV structure eliminates VA's ability to change and develop according to market conditions. Also, legislating the number of formularies items to be contracted within arbitrary timeframes could have unintended consequences. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my opening statement. We are happy to answer any questions from you or members of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mingo. And we will now hear from Ms. McMorris Rogers, who's just joined us, speaking in support of H.R. 3497, the Modernization of Medical Records Access for Veterans Act of 2017. Ms. McMorris Rogers, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate you making the time. I was on my way over and I was reading Political Playbook, but the Stars and Stripes article about what was just uncovered at the Department of Veterans Affairs here in D.C. But what really caught my eye was it talks about more than 1,300 boxes containing veterans' personal health and identification information were found unsecured in a warehouse, the hospital basement, and a trash bin, according to the report. Millions of dollars were spent without the controls to determine whether the expenses were necessary. So I want to just start by thanking the chairman, thank the ranking member for holding this important hearing to address a fundamental need that we have within the VA for comprehensive medical records for the veterans. Every day I hear from veterans in Eastern Washington who are in desperate need for help. And yet so often they feel like when they contact the VA that they're more of a burden than actually having the red carpet rolled out to them. And sometimes, and I hear this especially as it relates to obtaining as simple as your medical record. I've even heard from providers in the community that I represent who have been frustrated to the point of tears because they're unable to treat veterans because the patient cannot obtain their own medical records. Some veterans have waited more than 2 years to simply get their medical records from the VA. So this legislation that is before you, and I ask for your consideration, it simply provides a common sense, off-the-shelf, bipartisan solution to the problem. It's a pilot project, and it directs the Secretary of VA to establish a secure, patient-centered, portable medical record system that would allow veterans to have access to their own comprehensive medical records. As with most things in the VA, this is not an issue where the wheel must be reinvented. This technology already exists in the private sector. For example, Verdi. Now, they're a company based out of Washington State, but they've developed a secure, offline data repository with end-to-end encryption and remote record completion. We've discussed the security concerns that some may have in conversations with the VA Office of Information and Technology and this committee. And while these concerns would be valid in other scenarios, the technology that exists and that is in use today is secure and is HIPAA compliant. It's compatible across all electronic healthcare systems, including Cerner, and is encrypted end-to-end. The fact is it's in use today, and it does not make doctors resistant to accepting plug-in electronic devices from patients. With the technology that is currently deployed, patients have a current copy, the most up-to-date version of their medical records. It's as simple as putting it on a chip that is then portable. Specifically, one of the most important aspects of Verdi's technology is that they perform record completion. When a patient leaves his or her provider, they're leaving with the most up-to-date medical record information. It's updated immediately. While the VA department gives veterans access to the Blue Button Initiative through My Healthy Vet, this puts the burden on the veteran to be responsible for downloading, printing, and bringing their most up-to-date record to their doctor. With Verdi's technology, the veteran and the provider all have the information on a chip for easy access. There's also been concerns raised about the application performing interfaces regulations put forth by Health and Human Services. First of all, the VA is not regulated by HHS, and Verdi's technology is already in use today. Therefore, it is already up to date and in line with current regulations. It has the capability to be integrated directly and is already supporting direct data feeds in their deployments. I'm disappointed that the VA has chosen to oppose this legislation, that they've chosen to focus on the challenges rather than the opportunity here to offer our veterans high-quality care. Will there be challenges? Yes. But you know what? That shouldn't stop us. It hasn't stopped Americans in the past, and it shouldn't stop us today. My staff and I have held several meetings with the VA's Office of Information and Technology, where legislation was discussed, where Verdi was brought in to demonstrate their technology, and where draft legislation was sent to the VA before introduction for comments and concerns. Additionally, we have in writing that the Office of Information and Technology was supportive of this legislation. In the VA's words, this looks good to us. What this bill is proposing is a simple, common sense, off-the-shelf, readily available solution to a persistent problem. And while I'm pleased that the Secretary is serious about modernization of the EHR system, their approach, not only is the VA Cerner contract currently paused, the implementation period is 10 years. Since I came to Congress in 2005, the budget for the VA has doubled twice. It's nearly tripled. It went from 40 to 80 billion and now 80 billion to 160 billion. The VA has one mission: to serve our veterans. And I fear too often that the veterans getting lost in all of this, or we make it too difficult for them. So I thank you for your consideration of this legislation, and I just ask that the remainder of my statement be read into the record. Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Ms. McMorris-Rodgers. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Celli. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
The American Legion is proud to offer our position on the 4 bills being considered today, and I'll briefly touch on them before I move toward a discussion on the future of the electronic health care records project that ties all of these bills together. Chairman Bergman, Ranking Member Custer, and distinguished, dedicated defenders of veterans who proudly serve on this committee, and on behalf of Denise Rohan, the National Commander of the largest veteran service organization in the United States of America, representing more than 2 million dues-paying members, and combined with our American Legion family, whose numbers exceed 3.5 million voters living in every state and territory in America, it is my duty and honor to present the American Legion's position on the bills being discussed here today. The American Legion is unable to support the purchase card draft legislation that congressionally directs VA employee behavior and discipline. We expect the department to enforce and follow the statute and policies that are currently in place when employees misuse their authority and knowingly put taxpayer dollars at risk. We fully expect the VA to make management decisions and use their staff in a manner that is in keeping with prudent and judicious behavior. And when that behavior breaks down, we look to the VA to use the authority that this Congress has already given the Secretary to hold employees and managers accountable. We do support the other draft legislation being discussed today that would direct VA to compete prime vendor contracts, because we believe that it will assist VA with ensuring that more prime vendor contracts go to veteran-owned firms. The Department of Veterans Affairs serves veterans, and veterans should be given first right of refusal serving their community, provided that the services are on the same or greater quality and that the price is competitive. This theme guides all of the American Legion's policy recommendations regarding VA contracting programs. I'll dedicate the remainder of my time to discussing the VA electronic healthcare record program and the bills that address modernizing VA's primary IT infrastructure program. The American Legion is unable to support H.R. 3497, the Modernization of Medical Records Access for Veterans Act of 2017, not because we believe that the goal is off base, but because we believe that this and so much more is already incorporated into the pending EHR contract that the Department is getting ready to memorialize with the Cerner Corporation. As such, the American Legion supports H.R. 5254, but only insofar as it applies to the Cerner agreement and deployment of that EHR program. The contract that the VA has negotiated with Cerner Corporation will fundamentally change the course of American medical history by providing government standards for electronic health record communication and transferability, health maintenance, patient access, supply chain management, consults, follow-ups, and much, much more. The Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense are setting the stage for governmental interoperability that is poised to eventually become the national standard. Almost everything VA does from this point forward will affect and be affected by this platform, and replacing Vista and Alta are just the beginning. From here on out, this committee, as well as the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs and the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, are going to have to work together to ensure that uniformed American service members and their families are not only provided with a safe and effective transition from DoD to post-service medical care, but that their access to care at VA and in the community are all well coordinated. This is the direction that the committee has directed VA to take. It is long overdue, And this is the direction that the American Legion champions, and this is the project that Secretary Shulkin has led and is leading to completion. We, the veteran community, and this committee are at a critical juncture in time. We have a secretary who is under fire by ideologues who oppose progress, and a Congress and a community that supports and appreciates the work that he has done on behalf of more than 20 million veterans. Now is not the time to be silent, and I just hope that now is not the time to be silent and just hope that all works out okay. Now is the time to step up. Now is the time to be heard. And now is the time to join the Secretary and be part of this historic change at the Department of Veterans Affairs and set the stage for the largest modernization of medical coordination in American history. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Celli. Mr. Denniston, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Chairman Bergman, Ranking Member Custer, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the members of the National Veterans Small Business Coalition, I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to discuss the proposed pieces of legislation. The National Veterans Small Business Coalition is the largest nonprofit trade association representing veteran and service-disabled vets in the federal marketplace as prime and subcontractors. And I request that my remarks and the attachments be made part of the record. I'd like to first address H.R. 3497 and H.R. 4245 dealing with the veteran electronic health records. We believe H.R. 3497 to allow veterans to use a portable medical record storage system is good news for veterans, as it allows easier access to their own personal health records. H.R. 4245 appears to address Congress's concerns about the Secretary's announcement of the award to Cerner Corporation for the new electronic health care record. Our concern with this contract is that the VA is taking a very minimalistic approach to providing subcontracting opportunities for small businesses, including veteran and service-disabled vet small businesses. VA is only requiring the awardee to meet a minimum goal of 17% of subcontracting to small business, 5% to service-disabled vets, and 7% to veterans. And we know historically that information technology contracts generally provide greater opportunity for subcontracting to small business. As an example, the 2018 goals that the SBA has established with the Department of Defense for subcontracting is 33%, Department of Energy 42%, Department of Homeland Security 40%. So we think the VA can do a lot more than what they are proposing. Also, over the past 10 years, the VA has never once achieved its subcontracting goals negotiated with the Small Business Administration. Given VA's poor track record and the lower goals accepted for this contract, we implore this committee to include in H.R. 4245 a provision requiring the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to report to Congress on a quarterly basis the accomplishments against the small business subcontracting goal to include subcontract awards to veteran and service-disabled vet businesses. Next, I'd like to address the draft bill regarding employees found to knowingly misuse VA purchase cards. We're in support of the draft. Abuses of purchase card have been widespread, and we think this trend will only continue, given the fact that micro-purchase level is being raised from $3,500 to $10,000. But we've also found that many times these issues arise due to poorly written policies and training on the part of the VA acquisition leadership, not because VA employees are dishonest people. So we think that that needs to be addressed as well. The last draft bill he asked me to discuss directs the VA Secretary to carry out a medical surgical prime vendor program using multiple prime vendors. Before addressing the specifics of the draft, I want to share with you our observations having lived the current prime vendor program for the past 2 years in numerous meetings with both Veterans Health Administration and Strategic Acquisition Center leadership. The current program is being driven for contracting expediency, not based on clinical input to improve veteran patient care. There is little to no clinical input in our opinion. VHA and the SAC appear to work on conflicting timeframes. There is no strategic plan. Determining who is in charge is almost impossible, and the rules of engagement appear to change on a weekly basis. In the fall of 2017, when we learned that the SAC intended under MSPV 2.0 to award one contract for one prime vendor, we asked what was the position that service-disabled vets were going to play, and we were told you're going to be subcontractors. again, given the VA's responsibility or accomplishments in the last 10 years, when we asked, well, what's going to change? And the VA response to us was, you just have to trust us. Well, we don't trust VA. We don't trust VA to do what's right for service-disabled vets when it comes time for subcontracting. We also think that this is a way that VA wants to get around having to deal with the SBA non-manufacturable waiver, which I know that this committee is aware of. So we have a number of issues with that. Back in October, this committee had a roundtable and invited a number of groups to participate. And we provided the committee 8 specific recommendations in a letter, and we think that those are still very appropriate. But one of the things that I do want to mention in the last 30 seconds that I have is that to show that service-disabled vets can be part of the solution as opposed to the problem, the way that we know that VA looks at service-disabled vets now. We, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, in conjunction with one of our members, Veratix of Florida, is in the process of developing for the VA's use an online ordering platform very similar to Amazon for medical products, all from verified CVE small businesses, so that we're going to be able to give the VA a platform that will allow them to buy medical products under the micro-purchase threshold from service-disabled vets at prices much less than what they're buying from the prime vendors in the current process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Denniston. The written statements of those who have just provided oral testimony will be entered into the hearing record. We will now proceed to questioning. Ranking Member Custer, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bergman, and I appreciate all the testimony. I'm going to start, you were talking, the VA was talking about the Blue Button Initiative for pre-existing program where veterans are able to access, download, and print their own medical records. How does the VA balance the benefit of access to the medical records through the Blue Button Initiative against the costs of lessened security that can result?
Thank you for the question. I'll make a comment first because I'm a veteran. I downloaded the Blue Button, my record, and that's how I was really only able to solve my access to my record when I was treated out in town in a choice-related program. Specifically for that contract, though, and that question, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Katrina Tushamatelli, who will talk in that area.
Can you please repeat the last part of your question regarding security?
Well, my question is just how do you balance the security concerns with the simplicity and the access?
So we have to go through a rigorous process to meet the security requirements, not only HIPAA, but PII, PHI, and we make sure that those are, we have security teams that actually come out before we give an authority to operate. So for every single product we have, we go through that process. You don't get an authority to operate unless you've gone through and made sure that those security measures are met.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is, again, for the VA on HR 4245, again, about the Veterans Electronic Healthcare Record Modernization. Why do you believe that the deadlines and verbiage in HR 4245 should be altered? And should we incorporate your proposed deadlines? How confident are you that the VA will fully comply with the legislation?
Thank you. We are establishing the program office now for oversight of the actual contract. We've negotiated with Cerner for our contract. We've spent a lot of time in that area. We know these are typical documents that we will put in place to manage a large project. They actually take a lot of time, and they take coordination with the Cerner Corporation as well, with some of what we're doing in those oversight documents. This is a large-scoped project. When the Secretary signed the determination and finding and announced it back in June, at that phase where we would start negotiating with a vendor, a lot of these documents would have already been prepared. and it would have taken time. When that document when that was announced, there were 4 of us in VHA and 2 in OIT that knew that news was coming. There's a lot of people that we need to put in place and structure and an organization to put in place to implement and oversee this program. It just takes us time to
So
pull
if
those
we
together.
were to incorporate your deadlines, your proposed deadlines, how confident are you that the VA will fully comply?
I'm very confident that we'd be able to meet those, and some we'll have ahead of time. Others we would have that are going to just take longer. There's a lot of documents that's there.
And back to the American Legion, on this same bill, your testimony conveys general opposition to legislation that might impact VA's current efforts to adopt the Cerner electronic health record. Do you have any concerns specific to this bill that we should be keeping in mind if it advances to markup?
So the first thing is we completely support the Cerner project. We've been out there to the facility. We've seen an example of how this software can be deployed. We've seen all the different variables of how it can be enhanced. And we just believe that anything that this committee does going forward has to take that project in mind. And as far as timelines go, we absolutely support making sure that VA meet with this committee on a regular basis to ensure that they're meeting benchmarks and timelines. And if something goes awry, Congress needs to be the first ones to know. But we also believe that you should be working very closely with VA, as you're doing now, to ensure that they can meet the timelines that you're asking them to meet. And if they can't, they need to be able to provide a cogent reason as to why they can't meet those timelines and what the timelines should be, just as you're doing today.
So my time is up. If anyone else wants to comment on that, we can take it for the record. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Dunn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, General. And thank you very much for letting me be part of this hearing today. And I want to thank all the witnesses who are here testifying as well. I would emphasize my support for the purchase card draft bill and the medical surgical prime vendor draft bill. The purchase card misuse has been a chronic issue with the VA for years, and no one has been held accountable for this misfeasance. This draft codifies the prohibition of the abusing purchases at the expense of the taxpayers. Similarly, the medical surgical prime vendor draft bill keeps the department on track by fixing the current model and ensuring that the current medical formularies are broadened to better serve the patients. So, Mr. Lemon, I understand the VA is very close to hiring a permanent director to run the MSPV program. Do you have anything to announce today on that, such as when this person might begin work and what their qualifications are?
I don't. We've not hired the person as of today.
Can you share the qualifications for the kind of things you're looking for?
Well, we're certainly looking for someone that has a background working with clinicians and doing value analysis and sourcing clinical products. And my understanding is there's some good applicants. I think we'll be able to make a selection on that, but we've not hired the person.
Can you speculate on the timeline?
I think it will be soon.
Soon. Okay, thank you. Also, the industry has expressed frustration that the VA only selects a single supplier for each category of medical or surgical supply, and the regulations clearly allow you to select more than one, multiple vendors. Can you explain what the decision, on what basis the decision was made to choose a single supplier for each line?
Well, I believe that goes kind of to the contracting rules, but there are ways to work within the system to select more than one supplier. We try to utilize ordering officers in the facilities so that they can very efficiently order products and services without recompeting the items on a task order level. But there are ways to address that and still make awards with multiple suppliers, and that's the direction we plan to use going forward.
In general, by having multiple suppliers, you get them to compete against each other on price, and I'm concerned that you might not be getting that value added if you just have a single supplier. Is that fair?
Well, I think you want to get the most competitive and the best drive the best bargain you can when you award the contracts with your suppliers, and then have a system where ordering officers can order very efficiently as the hospitals need the items without running a second round of competition between multiple award.
All right, I want to be sure the competition was in there. Also, we spoke here several months ago, I think it was in December, about items that get into the supply chain that are in the gray zone. All right, so they aren't necessarily OEM, and they may not even be authorized OEM parts and whatnot. We talked about a letter of authorization being provided by the dealer, by the distributors from the OEM. Have we taken any actions on that?
We have. We do have policy on that, and we're strengthening it and providing guidance to our contracting officers to require distributors that aren't manufacturers to prove that they're an authorized distributor of the manufacturer to eliminate the possibility of gray market.
Can you state for a fact that gray market items are actually getting into the supply chain, or is it just something that we suspect?
I think there have been a very small number of instances where it has happened, but not on any scale.
Do you have any examples?
I don't have any prepared, but we probably could come back with a small number.
Let me tell you why I asked that, because in the world of robotic surgery, there's some aftermarket suppliers that clearly fit into the gray zone, and that can be a lot of money, those parts. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Rice, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Celli, if you could just expound a little more on your objections to the purchase card.
Thank you for asking me that question. So, we are never a fan of layering statute on top of statute to control behavior when the VA already has the authority to hold bad actors accountable. And honestly, I find it a bit offensive that the VA is asking for this legislation when they can do the same thing through policy today. There's no reason at all that the Secretary can't say, if you have acted in bad conduct with a purchase card, you are hereby suspended from having a purchase card. Why do they need Congress to tell them that? So we believe that Congress has been very generous with their oversight and the legislation that they have provided to VA to hold bad actors accountable and to remove bad actors from the program. I just find it difficult to understand why they need additional legislative authority to do something they can already do.
Well, clearly they haven't done it, and look, my personal feeling is, you give, 10,000 credit cards out, you get what you get. There's too many, it's like, I think it's just rife for abuse when you give purchasing authority to that many people.
Well, then
It's
we're
not just to the
speaking
VA,
to
it's in other places. But, I mean, I would assume that there are maybe, labor issues and stuff like that may constrain the hands of the Secretary of the VA. I don't know. I mean, maybe some people from the VA can talk about what difficulty there is in terms of holding people accountable who are not just one-time abusers of the purchasing authority, but multiple time abusers.
I'd like my colleague, Mr. John Adams, to talk to that, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to address this. I don't know that I can really speak on any labor issues because that's outside of my purview, but we do have somewhere in the neighborhood of 21,500 cards that are being used in the department. The annual spend since 15, I think you mentioned it was $4 billion. It's up to $4.2 billion now. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6.6 million transactions annually that we do with purchase cards. I think the record speaks for itself as far as the misuse that you've seen. I come from a DoD financial management background. I did 30 years in the Marine Corps, 12 of which was overseas. I understand the complexities of making payments in a dynamic environment, especially like in a combat zone. Still, we were able to find there within that environment ways to do it properly and legally without misusing the tools that were provided to us. So I think it's kind of, I'm a bit confused as to how we would not support a bill coming from the VA perspective to prevent misuse of the purchase cards.
So have you made those suggestions about how you did it and how that was more effective than the way it's being done now, or?
So I'm just coming into this role. I assumed it in January. So we are doing a comprehensive review of the policies around the purchase card and looking at all the metrics that we currently have regarding the purchase card use. We are trying to do some analytics around things like spend patterns and anomalies in spend patterns and those type of things, and doing perhaps some forensic accounting on the data to find ways to try to help the VA manage its purchase cards and the transactions that are being done with it.
Well, when that analysis is done, which I think is a great idea, because you obviously have experience in this area, I would love for you to share that with this committee.
Certainly, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just a couple questions for Mr. Lemon, I think. One aspect of the bill we've been discussing on the MSPV issue, it's not yet in the draft bill, is to require VA employees who conduct formulary analysis or decide which items are going to be included in the formulary have medical expertise that's relevant to those particular items. The concern we hear constantly from the stakeholders is that the wrong people are making medical decisions. So I just want to ask if you have any feelings about the bill language. If you've seen the language, do you agree? Do you have any objections? Any way you could inform us on that?
Although I support many of the underlying short-term objectives in the bill, I oppose legislating it. Now the part regarding involving clinicians and choosing products, I absolutely agree with, and we are working to implement a clinically driven sourcing model with robust structure to assure that product selection is based on clinical decisions. And so we completely agree with the concept that it shouldn't be contracting people determining what products our doctors should use. It should be the doctors. And we are working very diligently to implement a structure to do that.
So your concern is sort of maybe the quantitative goals, 20 to 33,000 items a year, 30,000 to 50,000 items a year. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, right now, commercial prime vendors, they may actually stock 30,000 items in a warehouse. So,
right.
You know, to say that we have to contract for 50, and honestly, if you look a few years down the road, if we're successful involving our clinicians, like you would like us to and we'd like to, we really think that's going to help reduce the overall formulary from 50,000 potentially to a much smaller number. So I would hate to legislate the actual number of items we should have on contract. That should be driven by clinical need.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, those are my questions. I yield back.
Thank you. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Mingo, I appreciate you coming to testify about our legislation today. I understand many of your colleagues in the Electronic Health Record Modernization Program are at the HIMSIS conference this week. Quite an acronym. Secretary Shulkin is delivering the keynote address on Friday. VA has issued a variety of press statements indicating it intends to award the primary contract this month. Do you have any sort of announcement to make or guidance on when we should expect an announcement?
Chairman, thank you very much for that question. I am as anxious as I think anybody in this room to hear the actual award date. I do not have any specific.
Are there any steps that still need to be, any I's needed to be dotted, T's needed to be crossed before the contract is awarded?
There were two additional, sir, I'd like to actually take that one for the record if I could and get back to you there. Just,
okay. Also, regarding H.R. 3497, Mr. Mango, you testified that it would be duplicative of the Electronic Health Record Modernization Program and divert resources away from it. You note that veterans can already download a copy of their medical records through what VA calls the Blue Button Initiative. Does that include every aspect of a veteran's medical record or just certain documents?
Actually, Chairman, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take that question for the record, and I'd like to tie it back to the Director Verma's comments that she did make at the HIMSS conference on Tuesday, where she announced the Blue Button 2.0 initiative. And I think there's a very good opportunity for the two agencies to work together in bringing that type of, all the data available for the veterans to gain access and the clinicians to have access to that record when it's needed together. So we'd like to come back and give you a better answer on that.
Okay. Do you say Lamont or Lamont?
Yes, Lamont.
Lamont, that's what I thought. Okay, Mr. Lamont, and you've testified before us before. The National Defense Authorization Act, which was enacted on December the 12th of this past year, increased the micro purchase threshold, which is also the transaction limit for purchase cards, from $3,500 to $10,000. When will this change actually go into effect?
I can't give you a date. I will say that agencies have the option to issue a deviation to the FAR until the regulation changes. My understanding is that the VA Office of Acquisition Policy is in the process of issuing that deviation, and then with the Office of Management, then implementation will be determined. But I don't know.
Can you give me a kind of like a year?
I believe with certainty it would be this year, but
okay. Well, when the transaction limit goes up and we finally get it, in place, you're going to be able to buy a lot more things with the increased dollar amount. Can you give me an idea of, has there been any discussion of what types of products that you plan to move over onto purchase cards?
Well, I think we have to take care. There's areas where it would be helpful now in terms of some prosthetic procurements, as well as to help with our med-surg supplies while we're working on a more robust catalog. But where we don't want to go from $4 billion of open market spend to 6 to 8. We want to put more national contracts in place and drive prices lower. So the goal really isn't to explode the purchase card program.
Okay, well, thank you.
I'd like to jump in on that question. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to jump in on that as well, because...
Are you going to use up the rest of my time here? Because I got one more question for Mr. Adams.
Oh.
You can try, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say...
Unless my colleagues disagree, can I have a little extra time here to finish my one last question?
We would grant you the courtesy.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, be brief.
At the HIMSS conference, our CIO did announce the use of the micro-purchase, the opportunity for really bringing innovation, which is what we would bring with the new Lighthouse initiative that you referenced earlier. And that type of threshold would enable those type of purchases as well, to bring in innovation meeting the veterans' needs and pulling those opportunities together.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Adams, VA's policy handbook for the purchase card program sets out penalties for misuse. The first offense ranges from admonishment to removal. The second offense ranges from a 7-day suspension to removal. The third offense ranges from a 14-day suspension to removal. Those are very wide ranges. I would argue an admonishment is not even a real penalty. It's kind of like being grounded without having your allowance taken away. Can you give me some examples of employees being removed for purchase card misuse?
Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any detailed data on any employees that may have been removed as a result of that.
Do you think there's something that exists in the VA records that you could, regardless of not necessarily names, but numbers or history?
I believe we could take that for the record.
I would appreciate that very much. With that, my thank you to my colleagues for allowing me to extend my question. Any appetite for a second round, or is everybody okay? All right. Thank you to the witnesses for your thoughtful input. The panel is now excused. The testimony provided today is an important contribution as we move forward with the legislation, particularly the 2 draft bills. The witnesses' expertise is valuable to help us refine and improve the bill texts. As you're well aware, this subcommittee's oversight and investigations of VA are frequently uncomfortable. So I appreciate VA's willingness to consider the ultimate objectives of today's legislation: improve efficiency, reduce waste, and provide better outcomes for veterans. There was a time when the department's default posture was to evade congressional scrutiny. I am happy to see the indications of that are beginning to change. And I wrote a couple extra notes here, Mr. Celli, because you kind of asked the why are we doing this. The reason the committee is put into a position of proposing this legislation is because of a VA's track record of accountability has been unacceptable by too many standards, especially those of us who have worn the cloth of our nation. We know what we sign up to when we swear an oath and the performance, and so well, again, we could probably spend time on other things, but we have a performance and accountability problem from the Committee of the Whole's view, and especially Oversight and Investigation. But we are hopeful that with new attitudes, new leadership, and a sense of urgency that I can see beginning to take shape now within the VA gives me cause for hope that the message is getting through as we, the committee, enable VA to take care of substandard, in some cases, illegal performance, and that's the why. So, having said that, I appreciate the bipartisan cooperation of all the sponsors and co-sponsors of today's legislation. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. I would like to once again, thank all of our witnesses and audience members for joining us here this afternoon. This hearing is now adjourned.